The atmosphere in the studio was electric as the audience eagerly awaited the arrival of Karoline Leavitt. The spotlight shone brightly, casting a dramatic glow on the stage. As the host, Jimmy Kimmel, prepared for the night's interview, there was an undeniable sense of anticipation in the air. Karoline, known for her sharp conservative views, was an unusual guest for the late-night talk show, and the crowd knew they were about to witness something different. Kimmel's usual light-hearted tone was replaced with an air of intensity, reflecting the unique nature of this encounter. When Karoline walked onto the stage, she exuded confidence. Dressed in a sharp, professional outfit, her demeanor was calm but assertive. The audience greeted her with a mixture of applause and curiosity, aware that this wouldn't be a typical exchange. As she took her seat opposite Kimmel, the tension between them was palpable. Kimmel, with his signature grin, extended a handshake, but it was clear that both were prepared for a conversation that would go beyond the usual small talk. Kimmel wasted no time in jumping straight into serious political discussions. He asked her directly about her views on the current state of the Republican Party, immediately setting a challenging tone. Karoline, however, was unfazed. With poise and precision, she responded, offering her insights on the challenges facing the party and the need for a more steadfast approach to conservatism. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Kimmel's usual comedic approach wasn't going to cut through the seriousness of Karoline's responses. The exchange became more intense with each passing minute, as Kimmel's questions grew more probing. He brought up recent controversies surrounding conservative figures, subtly attempting to provoke a reaction from Karoline. But she held her ground, speaking passionately about her beliefs, defending her party's values with conviction. The audience, which had initially been caught off guard by the tense atmosphere, now found themselves hanging on every word. Kimmel's attempts at humor were met with Karoline's steadfast answers, making it clear that she was there for a purpose, to make her point, not to entertain. The dynamic between the two grew increasingly charged. Kimmel, known for his quick wit, found himself in a position where his usual style didn't quite work. Karoline, on the other hand, was fully in control of the conversation, refusing to back down or be swayed. The audience's reactions were mixed. Some applauded her composure, while others seemed uncomfortable with the intensity of the debate. It was evident that Kimmel was enjoying the challenge, but it was also clear that the conversation had taken a turn into unfamiliar territory. The air in the studio shifted as the conversation between Jimmy Kimmel and Karoline Leavitt grew more heated. What had begun as a polite exchange of views quickly morphed into a more intense confrontation. Kimmel, sensing an opportunity to push deeper, leaned forward in his chair, his tone shifting from casual curiosity to more pointed skepticism. The audience, who had been enjoying the usual back-and-forth banter of the late-night format, now found themselves in the midst of something far more serious. Kimmel's questions grew sharper, each one designed to provoke a reaction. He brought up the growing divisions within the Republican Party, questioning whether the party was losing its way. He spoke about the increasing influence of more moderate voices within the GOP, suggesting that the party was struggling to maintain its traditional identity. His words were pointed, but Karoline remained calm, her expression unwavering as she prepared to respond. With a calm yet assertive tone, Karoline fired back. Defending her position, she rejected the idea that the party was divided, instead arguing that the core principles of conservatism were stronger than ever. She spoke about the need for a return to those foundational values, criticizing what she saw as an overemphasis on compromise and moderation in American politics. She made it clear that she believed the Republican Party had to stand firm in its convictions if it wanted to regain its strength and relevance in the political landscape. As the conversation progressed, the tension between the two became undeniable. Kimmel, not one to shy away from a challenge, pushed back even harder. He raised concerns about the direction the party was heading, referencing various controversies involving prominent Republican figures. His tone became more critical, attempting to point out the hypocrisy he believed was rampant in the party's actions. He seemed intent on forcing Karoline into a defensive position, hoping to catch her in a contradiction or expose a flaw in her argument. But Karoline, unflinching, was more than prepared. She responded by pointing out what she believed to be the media's biased portrayal of the party. She argued that the scandals and controversies were often blown out of proportion, used as tools to undermine conservative ideals. Her words were sharp, and the crowd could feel the mounting tension in the room as the ideological divide between them became ever clearer. With each passing moment, the dynamic of the interview shifted. The playful back and forth typical of late-night TV gave way to a more serious debate, with both participants refusing to yield an inch. The audience, who had initially expected a light-hearted conversation, was now riveted, caught in the middle of this ideological clash. Kimmel's usual jokes were replaced by probing questions, and Karoline's responses became more impassioned and resolute. There was no humor now, only the raw intensity of two people fighting for their beliefs in front of a national audience. Kimmel, recognizing that he wasn't going to get the reaction he had hoped for, tried to shift the conversation to another topic, hoping to regain control of the interview. But Karoline, sensing an opening, didn't let up. She took the opportunity to turn the conversation back to the issues she cared most about, refusing to be derailed. Her confidence grew as the conversation continued, and it was clear that she wasn't intimidated by Kimmel's attempts to provoke her. As the debate raged on, the audience was left in awe of the fierce exchange unfolding before them. It was clear that this wasn't just an interview, it was a battle of ideologies, with each side staking a claim for their vision of America's future. Karoline's unwavering defense of her beliefs contrasted sharply with Kimmel's sharp critiques, creating a palpable tension that kept the audience on edge. As the conversation between Karoline Leavitt and Jimmy Kimmel intensified, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The initial cordiality that had marked the beginning of the interview was now gone, replaced by a fierce ideological clash. Kimmel, unable to mask his growing frustration, decided to pivot to a particularly contentious issue: the future of the Republican Party and its direction. He asked Karoline point-blank whether she believed the party had strayed too far from its original conservative principles in its pursuit of new voters and a broader audience. Karoline's response was immediate and unwavering. She rejected the premise of Kimmel's question outright, arguing that the Republican Party was, in fact, more aligned with its foundational values than ever before. She spoke passionately about the importance of staying true to conservative principles, warning against the dangers of compromising on core issues in an attempt to appease moderates or gain political advantage. Her eyes were focused and intense as she made it clear that any shift away from the party's principles was, in her view, a betrayal of the very values that had made the GOP a strong force in American politics. Kimmel, undeterred, pressed further. He asked her about the growing influence of populism within the party, suggesting that it was pushing the GOP toward more extreme positions. He referenced the rise of figures like Donald Trump, whose brand of politics had dramatically reshaped the Republican Party in recent years. Kimmel's tone became sharper, challenging Karoline to address the potential dangers of this shift toward populism, especially when it came to issues like immigration, racial tensions, and the handling of the pandemic. Karoline's response was no less passionate. She argued that the rise of populism was a direct reflection of the American public's frustration with the political establishment. She made the case that populism wasn't necessarily extreme, but rather a rejection of the status quo, an attempt to bring fresh ideas and solutions to a broken system. As she spoke, her voice grew more determined, as if she was not only defending her own beliefs but also the future of the conservative movement. She countered Kimmel's accusations, framing the rise of populism as a necessary shift that was in line with the core values of the GOP: individual freedom, personal responsibility, and a desire to return to what she saw as the nation's true identity. The back and forth between the two reached new heights of intensity. Kimmel, sensing that Karoline was getting more entrenched in her stance, threw in another pointed question. He asked her about the influence of conspiracy theories and misinformation within the party, particularly in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Kimmel's words were aimed at highlighting the division and mistrust that had taken root within the political landscape, suggesting that the Republican Party's embrace of certain fringe elements was only deepening the nation's divisions. Karoline, with a steely gaze, responded by arguing that the media was largely to blame for spreading misinformation. She accused the mainstream media of distorting the truth, framing conservative views in a negative light while ignoring or downplaying the issues that mattered most to voters. She was careful with her words, ensuring that her response was measured but firm. She reminded Kimmel and the audience that conservatives were not a monolithic group, and that the actions of a few should not define the entire movement. Her words were calculated, but her conviction was clear: she would not allow her party to be defined by its critics. As the exchange continued, the studio felt charged with an electricity that kept the audience at the edge of their seats. Every word from both Kimmel and Karoline carried weight, and it was clear that neither side was willing to back down. Kimmel tried to poke holes in her arguments, but Karoline held firm, never flinching in the face of his attacks. The ideological divide between them was widening, and the interview had taken on an almost adversarial tone. For Karoline, this wasn't just an interview, it was a battlefield. She was fighting for her vision of the Republican Party and her place within it. She knew that her words would resonate with a portion of the audience, and she was determined to make her case as forcefully as possible. At the same time, she recognized that the stakes were higher than just this conversation. This was about shaping the narrative, influencing the way people saw her, and defining the future of conservatism. The clash of ideas continued, unabated, with Kimmel trying to find cracks in Karoline's arguments and Karoline holding her ground, never once losing her composure. The back and forth had reached a fever pitch, and it was clear that neither participant would relent. The debate had transcended mere political differences. It had become a battle for the very soul of the Republican Party, with Karoline fighting to maintain its traditional conservative identity and Kimmel challenging her to acknowledge the realities of a rapidly changing political landscape. The tension in the room was palpable, and the audience could feel the weight of every exchange. The conversation reached a boiling point as Karoline Leavitt and Jimmy Kimmel continued their back and forth. The audience, initially captivated by the debate, now seemed to sense the escalating tension between the two. Kimmel's usual playful banter was nowhere to be found. He was visibly pressing harder, each question more pointed and confrontational than the last. Karoline, however, stood her ground, her resolve only growing stronger as the debate progressed. It was clear that neither party was going to back down, but the interview had taken a distinct turn. It wasn't just a clash of ideas anymore, it was a battle of wills. In a move that shocked both the audience and Kimmel, Karoline suddenly stood up from her seat, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. The unexpected action threw Kimmel off for a moment, and he paused, his grin faltering as he looked up at her. The room fell into a brief, stunned silence. Karoline's face, usually calm and composed, was now set in a determined expression, her eyes unwavering as she turned toward Kimmel. She had clearly reached a breaking point, and her body language communicated it all. She was no longer willing to continue under these circumstances. Without saying a word, Karoline began to walk away from her seat. The abruptness of her movement sent ripples through the audience. They sat frozen, unsure of what was happening. Kimmel, clearly caught off guard, remained in his chair for a moment, staring at her with a mixture of surprise and confusion. His usual wit seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden realization that the situation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. As Karoline made her way toward the exit, Kimmel quickly regained his composure, attempting to salvage the situation with a light-hearted comment. "Well, I guess we're done here," he said, his voice carrying an air of forced humor, but it was clear that his attempt at levity couldn't mask the gravity of what had just transpired. Karoline, however, didn't even glance back at him. Her movements were resolute, and with one final stride, she exited the stage, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The tension in the room was thick, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire studio held its breath. Kimmel sat there, visibly trying to process what had just happened, while the camera focused on him, waiting for a reaction. He let out a soft, almost defeated laugh, but it was clear that the playful atmosphere that had once defined Jimmy Kimmel Live had dissipated entirely. The show's energy had shifted from a fun late-night conversation to something far more uncomfortable. The studio audience was still in shock. A few murmurs broke the silence, but there was no applause, no cheering, just a stunned, uneasy quiet. The producers, who had no doubt anticipated the interview to go differently, scrambled behind the scenes, unsure of how to handle the unexpected turn of events. The crew was quick to adjust, preparing for the inevitable awkwardness that would follow the abrupt departure. For a few moments, Kimmel sat alone in the spotlight, the laughter and energy of the typical late-night interview now replaced by an unsettling stillness. His gaze drifted to the empty chair where Karoline had been moments before, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely caught off guard. He adjusted his mic, cleared his throat, and faced the camera, now tasked with managing the fallout of what had just transpired. "Well, that was unexpected," Kimmel said, his voice tinged with the discomfort that hung in the air. He paused, then tried to shift the conversation, attempting to bring the show back to its usual rhythm. But the damage had been done. The audience, still reeling from Karoline's sudden exit, could hardly focus on Kimmel's attempt to re-establish normalcy. In the minutes that followed, Kimmel attempted to fill the silence with commentary, joking about the unpredictability of live TV, but it was clear that the audience's attention was no longer on him. The incident with Karoline had overshadowed everything else, and the room felt charged with a palpable tension. Kimmel's playful persona couldn't mask the fact that this was no longer just an ordinary night at Jimmy Kimmel Live. As the camera panned away, the production team worked to regroup, and Kimmel, still processing the unexpected turn of events, tried to regain his composure. But the interview had left an indelible mark. The suddenness of Karoline's exit and the intensity of the exchange would linger long after the show ended, leaving viewers to question what had really unfolded between the two. Was it a political disagreement, a clash of personalities, or was it simply the unraveling of what was meant to be a lighthearted late-night interview turned confrontation? Regardless, it was a moment that no one in that studio would soon forget. As the final moments of the interview unfolded, the tension in the room had reached a fever pitch. Karoline Leavitt's abrupt exit had left everyone stunned, and Jimmy Kimmel, now alone on the stage, was grappling with the fallout. The camera lingered on Kimmel as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trying to maintain the facade of calm that was expected from a late-night host. His face, usually full of quick wit and charm, was now marked with a hint of disbelief. The energy in the studio had completely changed, and the once bustling set now felt eerily quiet.